I have never played a Final Fantasy game before. I've always been intrigued by this series given how much high praise it's attracted over the years, but just never decided to actually try one until now. Like many others, I have been closely following the marketing behind this game ever since it was announced. I heard it was going to be a new foundation that the next mainline Final Fantasy games will use, and is meant to be a good entry point for people like me that have always wanted to get into this series for years, but just didn't know where to start. Certain aspects of Final Fantasy XVI represent the absolute peak of what a modern AAA game can offer right now, but unfortunately not all parts of this game hold up to the same standard. As of today, I can now say that I have beaten a Final Fantasy game, and I want to share that experience with you in case you're like me wondering if you should buy this game, or if you're a franchise veteran just looking for a more unique perspective. I hope you enjoy my review of Final Fantasy XVI. Before I start, I want to quickly establish what this game is and what it is not for those unaware. Final Fantasy XVI is a narrative-led character action game that focuses on two things, story and combat. There are other elements to it that I'll get into later, but those are the two main things that make up the bulk of this experience. The game is set in a place called Valisthea, in which magic exists and is essentially the driving force of the entire narrative. In this world, normal people are unable to use magic without the help of crystals, but there are also those born with the ability to use magic without one of these, called bearers. These people are looked at as slaves and are treated as such everywhere with a few exceptions. They are also branded with a large mark on their face in order to separate them from those that lack their power. This leads me to the main protagonist of Final Fantasy XVI, Clive Rossfield, a bearer and firstborn son to one of the land's rulers. At the start of the game, you witness Clive in his mid-teenage years, where he is tasked with protecting his younger brother Joshua, who is also a very important character. In Final Fantasy XVI, there are people referred to as dominants, which possess an incredibly rare power to control these things called icons. Icons are these massive otherworldly beasts that grant its owner incredible power that they can choose to use for good or bad. Clive's brother, Joshua, is one of these dominants, and is set to be the heir to the throne because of it. Clive is then tasked with protecting his brother at all costs, but unfortunately this doesn't last long as Joshua is killed very early into the story. This event sends Clive into a state of revenge and kicks off the main portion of Final Fantasy XVI's story. We then fast forward 13 years where Clive is now an adult, still on the hunt to find and kill the one responsible for his brother's death. Some other events happen that I'm not going to spoil, and then it becomes clear to Clive that avenging his brother is no longer his only objective in his life. He must now also destroy these things called Mother Crystals, which are the life source of all magic in Valisthea. There's obviously a lot of things I'm leaving out because I don't want to spoil anything major in this review, but that should give you a pretty good idea of what this game is about. Another thing important I want to mention is that this game is really cutscene heavy. I'm talking about at least 50% of your time in Final Fantasy XVI is just watching the story unfold. Now, most people that play this game are either going to love that or hate it. Personally, I'm somewhere in between. Most times I really enjoyed watching these cutscenes unfold because they tell the story in a clearer way than just dialogue could, but there are also plenty of times where I really wanted a certain scene to end because it just wasn't interesting to me. Final Fantasy XVI can often feel like it's trying to be more like Game of Thrones rather than an actual video game sometimes, and I genuinely believe that a lot of people aren't going to finish this game because they just don't feel like watching an entire TV show's worth of cutscenes. Now, as far as what I actually thought of the story itself, I liked it, mostly. What really had me hooked from the start was Clive, and his will to keep going no matter what he was up against. I was always happy to watch any scene he was involved in unfold and how he would respond. I also liked the majority of the side characters that joined Clyde in his adventure because none of them ever overstayed their welcome and they all felt like solid, unique additions to the roster. The story also does a pretty great job at getting the player up to speed at what is happening at that moment. A lot of missions begin with this super well animated map overview that has a narrator explaining where everyone is going next and why they are going there. There's even this super detailed storybook that you can go to whenever you want to catch up on specific characters, terminologies, and events if you feel lost or confused about something. The things that I didn't enjoy about the story mostly came down to what I felt didn't need to be included. There's several points throughout the game that just feel really unnecessary and drawn out for the sake of padding. and the game often introduces characters that you have zero interest in, and you'll have to do a string of quests for them that contribute next to nothing to the overall plot. The story can also be a bit much at times when it just spews information at you, and you will absolutely get lost if you aren't paying super close attention. It's a very political game about kingdoms and rulers disagreeing with one another regarding how things should be done, and I imagine many people aren't going to like that aspect of it. Overall, though, I really liked the story that Final Fantasy XVI tells, and it's definitely going to stick with me for a long time. Now let's talk about the other thing that really makes this game. Alright, so as you now know, Final Fantasy XVI is a third-person action game similar to other games like Bayonetta and Nier Automata, but it also sets itself apart in a pretty unique way. There are two different styles of combat in this game, Clive and Icon. As Clive, you have access to the standard melee combos that this type of game is known for at this point. Where this game sets itself apart is when you start to incorporate the Icon abilities into your combos and attacks. You do this by holding a specific button and then selecting whatever Icon ability you want to use. After you use one, it then goes on a short or long cooldown depending on how effective that specific ability is. At the start of the game, Clive's Icon abilities are very limited and you only have access to one set of them, but as the game goes on you get more and more of these. You can also switch between up to 3 icons at a time and cycle between each of their abilities. These abilities are what ultimately make up the combat experience in Final Fantasy XVI. It's all about knowing which icon ability to use and when to use it to be the most effective. You can also upgrade each ability with currency that you get from doing main and side quests, so once you find some that you really like, it's good to upgrade those ones. Now I also mentioned a bit ago that there are two different styles of combat, Clive, which we just went over, and Icon. Icon combat is only available during specific story moments where Clive will take control of his own icon to fight another one. These are not great, unfortunately, at least from a gameplay perspective. And the reason I mentioned that last part is because these are pretty much purely for spectacle. These fights are some of the most visually impressive things that you will ever see in a video game. I mean, I genuinely do not understand how a group of people and some computers are able to create some of the things that happen in these scenes. These moments are always an extreme highlight in the game, and I was just awestruck watching every single one of them. However, from a gameplay perspective, these don't offer much at all. They rely very hard on quick-time events, which feels like a very dated mechanic at this point, and the real-time attacks that you do have are very simple and almost always result in you just mashing the attack button until the enemy's health bar reaches 0. I'm not joking, you do not need to worry about taking damage during these sections because you have so much health and do so much damage that it's basically impossible to fail these no matter what you do. That easy difficulty, by the way, kind of extends to the entire game too when you play as normal Clive. I actually didn't die a single time in this game. And that's not me trying to show off or whatever, it's just that this game never really feels challenging because enemy attacks don't do much damage, and the windows that you get for dodging their attacks are very generous. You can, however, find optional enemies that do pose a much higher threat than anything on the main path, so you can find challenge if you really want to. There's also a New Game Plus mode that makes the game much harder, so there's that. Overall, I think the combat in Final Fantasy XVI is great, because of its satisfying ability system and rewarding upgrades that make you feel stronger the further you get into it. Moving on to presentation, and it's a bit of a mixed bag here unfortunately, starting with how it looks. So Final Fantasy XVI has two graphics modes on PS5, one that targets resolution and one that targets frame rate. Both of these aren't great and have their own problems. The resolution mode obviously looks better than the frame rate mode, but it is locked at 30 FPS. That in itself really sucks for a game like this, given how fast-paced the combat can be at times, so that's already a huge downside. I also don't know if it's just me, but I feel like the 30 FPS in this game feels worse than other 30 FPS games. I don't really know how to describe it other than it just feels worse than it should. Like, I've been playing a lot of Tears of the Kingdom lately, and the 30 FPS in that game doesn't bother me, but here it just feels awful. Then there's the performance mode, which targets 60 FPS, but it almost never reaches that in my experience. The resolution also just falls off a cliff in this mode. I mean, I'm no expert, but this game literally looks like it's running at like 600p or something in the more open areas in this mode. I ultimately went with this mode anyway, just because of how much I value frame rate over visuals. But yeah, really not good news here for either mode, and I hope this can be addressed later on. Now, performance aside, how does Final Fantasy XVI actually look? Well, I would say that in most cases, it looks good, not great. There are definitely some standout locations for sure that give you a really nice view of the land, and many of the indoor and smaller scale locations look particularly nice. But at the same time, the more open areas in the game are really empty and just boring to look at aside from the icon fights. There really isn't anything in Final Fantasy XVI that screams current gen to me, and I think it generally looks pretty dated next to some other recent titles. One thing though that I absolutely cannot praise this game enough for is its music. From its quieter exploration driven songs to its over the top insane icon fight tracks, Final Fantasy XVI is an absolute treat to listen to all the way through, and it definitely lives up to this franchise's reputation for great music. Oh, and as far as bugs go, I didn't encounter any, so great news there. The last major thing I want to discuss is how this game handles progression. So Final Fantasy XVI uses a typical mission-based structure found in other games like this, but also has multiple open areas that you can explore. I know a lot of people were expecting this game to be open world and were disappointed when they found out that it's not, but I'm personally very sick of what feels like every other AAA game being open world these days, so something more linear and scaled back was perfectly fine with me. There is also a decent amount of side content to be found in Final Fantasy XVI, such as side quests that give you currency and important equipment upgrades, as well as optional enemy encounters to find. These are very hit or miss in my experience. Some of the side quests in this game are genuinely terrible, and I question why some of them were included at all. Some of them are so basic and offer basically zero reward for doing them that they just come off as padding. On the other hand though, some of them are very good and add a lot to the overall experience. There's certain side quests that have a little plus sign on them, and these are the ones that you really want to do because they give you vital upgrades to your gear, and one even gives you a mount. The normal ones though are pretty 50-50 whether you get a good one or not. Even some of the main quests have this wildly inconsistent level of quality to them. One minute you'll be in the most epic boss fight you ever seen in a video game, and then 10 minutes later you'll be collecting dirt. No, I am not joking, that is actually something that happens. I think a lot of fat could have been trimmed from this game, as there's some real low points in it that just don't feel like they need to be there and were only included to make it longer. I think it would have been better if it was just a bit more condensed and would have felt much more polished as a result. All in all, I really enjoyed my time with Final Fantasy XVI, and I think it's absolutely a game worth checking out for anyone interested in it. And hey, there's always that free demo if you're still not sure. It's got some fairly substantial issues, but I think what this game gets right more than outweighs those. Still though, I hope the developers can take a look at the feedback and improve upon this formula for future Final Fantasy games. Thank you for watching my review of Final Fantasy XVI.